Good evening, sir. Good evening to everyone. Heartily welcome to all participants from today program in Rashtrobigyan Chorcha Kendra. I am happy to share that the most respectful and renowned educationalist, not only nationally but also internationally famous, Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan has been joined with us. We are very much fortunate that Sir is going to give us his valuable and precious time from his earthy busy schedule. I am over to Payal and request for further continuation. Payal, please.
A.K. Ramakrishnan Sir is professor and former chairperson of the Center for West Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. He has also been director of the Human Rights Studies program at JNU. Earlier, he was professor and director of the Center for West Asian Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and director of the School of International Relations and Politics, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, Kerala. He was a distinguished international scholar at Bucknell University, Pennsylvania, USA, and a visiting professor in Alameda Tabatabai University, Tehran, Iran. He was also Erasmus visiting professor at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona, Spain, and Kaunas Technical University, Kaunas, Lithuania. Areas of his interest include West Asian studies, theories of international relations, gender, and post-colonialism. He has published widely in English and Malayalam. He has published the book US Participation of Iran, Approaches and Policies, and Co-Edited Society and Change in the Contemporary Gulf. His articles and reviews have been published in journals such as International Studies, Scandinavian Journal of Development Alternatives and Area Studies, Millennium, Journal of International Studies, Contemporary South Asia and Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, sir, thank you and namaskar for joining us. We welcome to our platform. We request you to start today's seminar. Thank you.
First of all, I should thank the Rashtrobigyan Chorcha Kendra for inviting me to address you all today. I'm very happy to be here, and I came to know that you are organizing many programs related to international relations and political science. And I'm very happy to be a participant and contributing to the process of discussion that you have initiated. My task today is to talk about the Palestine question, which has been a very significant international issue for quite a long period of time now. What I will do today is to stress upon the significance of the Palestine issue by going into the history of the Palestine problem as such, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and will address some of the contemporary dimensions of the Palestine question. The usual kind of understanding about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that people think it is basically an issue of religious conflict, an issue of the problem between the Jews and the Muslims. And people think about the Palestine problem as something which is a regional issue in that part of West Asia. These kinds of general understanding of the problem do not do justice to what actually the Palestine question is. The Palestine question, to me, fundamentally is a political question, even though there are other elements like religion, questions of refugees, the status of Jerusalem, etc., involved in this. Fundamentally, it is a problem of the national liberation struggle of the Palestinian people, which has not been successful in establishing a sovereign state as far as Palestinians are concerned. What are the problems that they face in the road to the achievement of that quest for an independent Palestinian state? There are several problems, and we will address some of them, the major ones today. So to start with, to my mind, in my thinking and approach to the Palestine question is a question that is asking for decolonization in the contemporary world. Many of us believe that the decolonization process has already been finished. Many countries in the in the 40s in South Asia, in the 60s in Africa, various parts of Africa, and then with the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa, etc., that long historical process starting from the 19th century, that independence movement, that national liberation struggles have come to an end. That is what people think. But in the case of Palestine, that era of national liberation struggle did not yield the desired results as far as the Palestinians are concerned. And therefore, the way they face colonization of their land, the way they face political suppression from the state of Israel on the one hand, which is supported by the United States, etc. The problem of colonialism and imperialism is still a major problem that the Palestinians had to address. So when I say Palestine issue is a political issue, it is an issue of the politics of decolonization at this moment. That means that the Palestinians face colonialism, particularly settler colonialism, as an everyday reality as far as they are concerned. And therefore, the Palestinian struggle is basically a struggle for the achievement of an independent sovereign state in Palestine, which is devoid of these colonial domination, occupation, and oppression. So this, to my mind, is very significant. And I'll explain what I mean by the colonial policies in Palestine, the settler colonial, nature of, the Zionist ideology to start with, and then later with the State of Israel. The history of the Palestinian problem arose out of the experiences of the Palestinian people of two kinds of colonialisms. From the late 19th century onwards, more so in the first half of the 20th century. One colonialism, one form of colonialism they were facing was British colonialism, like what we were facing, but there was a difference in the case of Palestine, in the case of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and so on, because Palestine was under the British mandate after the First World War. And so it was the colonial administration of Great Britain that was controlling the politics of Palestine until 1948. Along with the European colonization of the British Empire coming to Palestine, there was another very significant nationalist imagination from Europe, which is called Zionism, emerging in its political form in the late 19th century. And that ideology of a Jewish homeland, propounded by leaders like Theodor Herzl, and they forming a World Zionist Organization in 1897. And the World Zionist Organization trying over a period of time, several decades, to fund, to initiate, to lobby for the colonization of Palestine. So there is British colonization on the one hand and Zionist colonization of Palestine on the other. Two European colonialisms working in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. And the Palestinian people in historic Palestine were struggling against these two forces. And the waves of immigration of Jewish people under the aegis of the World Zionist Organization started coming in big numbers. Even before the establishment of the World Zionist Organization in 1897, there were Jewish immigrants coming from Russia, for example, to Palestine. But those were certain waves of immigration that people move from one country to the other due to several reasons. In the European case, including in the Russian case, there was extreme form of anti-Semitism in Europe, anti-Jewish feelings, which were there for several centuries in European history. But it became much more prominent during the era of modern nationalisms in Europe. And the imagination of European nations as a monolithic entity was creating problem for the Jewish minorities. And there were economic reasons. They were keeping away of the Jewish bourgeoisie from national development within Europe, and therefore the growth of Jewish business, etc., were curtailed by using anti-Semitist ideology in Europe. And therefore the Jewish people really had a problem in Europe. But they were not, in general, by late 19th century were not thinking about a solution to their problem outside of Europe. Most of them were thinking that this is a European problem that has to be settled within Europe. But with the establishment of the World Zionist Organization under the leadership of Theodor Herzl, that kind of attitude started changing, because the World Zionist Organization, Theodor Herzl in 1896 published a booklet. People can read that. That's available in the internet, where Theodor Herzl was talking about the possibility of establishing a Jewish state. That book is called The Jewish State, Der Judenstaat. And he was talking about, in one subheading of that book is Argentine or Palestine, whether we have to think about a national homeland for the Jews in Argentina or in Palestine. There were other discussions also about Africa, Uganda in particular, and so on, where to establish a Jewish national home. This was the thinking. And in 1897, when the first World Zionist Congress was proposed to be organized in Munich, there were opposition from Jewish people, local Jewish people, against this kind of new political formation of the Jews, seeking a Jewish homeland elsewhere in the world, in Palestine or in Argentina or in Africa and things like that. And therefore that meeting could not be held in Munich. Theodor Herzl and his colleagues have to shift the meeting to Switzerland, to Basel, where the first World Zionist Congress was held. And one of the major resolutions of the World Zionist Organization in its first conference was the colonization of Palestine. So Palestine was becoming the focus area where a Jewish state has to be established. These are all European thinking coming from Europe. You should remember that. And later, as I've hinted earlier, there was, a concerted effort by the World Zionist Organization. A Jewish National Fund, etc., were organized. So there was the organized effort to bring Jewish people from Europe, various parts of Europe, to Palestine. And, the Jews call it the aliyahs, the waves of immigration. And those waves were coming in a big manner from late 19th century. Certain other waves have already happened, as I've told you, from Russia, etc. So when these waves of immigration started coming to Palestine, it was in the early stages, in the early part of the 20th century also, it was not a big problem. But by the 1920s and 30s, particularly by the 1930s, it became a big problem because large chunk of people were coming into Palestine from Europe. And ultimately, this resulted in a kind of civil war situation in Palestine. A situation where the original inhabitants of Palestine, they were of different religions, etc., particularly Muslims and Christians, because a Jewish homeland is coming, it was claiming to be a place for all Jews. So European Jewish immigration creating a situation of local opposition in Palestine. And 1936 to 1939, there was big conflict between the inhabitants of Palestine and the newly immigrated people coming from Europe. And from the 1920s, British mandatory system was working, it was ruling Palestine. And that mandatory system itself is extremely colonial. It was mandated by the League of Nations, but that mandatory provision says that Britain and France, who were victorious powers in the war, in the First World War, were seeking to control the West Asian region, where the Ottoman Empire was becoming weak and ultimately being totally defeated in the First World War. So territories which were earlier under the Ottoman rule, including Palestine, Palestine became a mandated territory of Britain, that mandate given by the League of Nations. The League of Nations said the civilized nations, who are the civilized nations in their understanding, it is Britain and France. And those civilized nations should control to rule these territories. And the mandatory provision says, until these people acquire the ability to rule themselves. You see, these are clear-cut colonial civilizing mission of talking about people of Asia as people who have to be ruled by Western powers like Britain and France. And that kind of mandate was given to Britain in Palestine. And the British mandatory power was supporting the Zionist cause, Zionism as Jewish nationalism emerging through the World Zionist Organization, I've told you, and who were conducting the aliyahs, the waves of immigration to Palestine. What is significant is that in 1917 itself, before Britain became a mandatory power in Palestine, the British government has already declared through the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that the British government, at that time, His Majesty's government, not Her Majesty, that was later. So the British government said, Lord Balfour, the Foreign Secretary, issued this to Lord Rothschild, who was the Zionist leader. And the Balfour Declaration said the British government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home. And it also says that this should not affect the original people in Palestine. But what is important for the Zionist organization was the first part of Balfour Declaration. So the most important superpower of the world at that point of time, Britain, with all its empire and so on, it was supporting the idea of Jewish national home in Palestine, even though this is coming through a systematic immigration of Jews from Europe over the original inhabitants of Palestine. And with, armed with that kind of an approval from the British government, the British mandatory system in Palestine, coming from the early 1920s, normally you could expect British government support to the Zionist cause, and that was happening in a big manner. And when the situation became almost a civil war by 1936, the British government tried to resolve the issue, but as as you have seen in South Asia, uh, in its colonies elsewhere as well, that divide and rule policy was more suitable for British interests. And therefore, it was taking advantage of the schism, the kind of division that was created within Palestine between the Palestinians and the newly immigrant Jewish community, mostly of European origins. And that conflict became more intense once Europe started facing the growth of Nazi ideology and Hitler's rule in Germany and fascism in Italy. And the Nazi ideology, you know, was extremely anti-Semitic, and it killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. And that situation prompted more Jewish people coming from Europe to various parts of the world. Large chunk of Jewish people were going to the United States, etc., during this extreme situation in Germany, Nazi atrocities on Jews. But the waves of immigration to Palestine also increased in a substantial manner because of the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews. So by 1940s, what you have is that the British mandatory power deciding that it will not continue its rule in Palestine. They said in 1947 itself, by May 15, 1948, British power would be withdrawing from Palestine because already, you know, its major colony, India, was, you know, gaining independence in 1947. And many of the strategic calculation of Britain was going extremely wrong, and then so on. Big superpower status was, in a way, reducing across the world, and the British power was not the power that we have seen in other eras of modern history, as you know. So that diminishing of British power is also very important. So in 1947, because there was the impending British withdrawal from Palestine by 1948, 1947, by this time, you know, the Second World War was over and the United Nations came into being. The United Nations, you know, it was approached by all the actors, British and other actors within in the Palestinian issue. And the United Nations established a committee, United Nations Special Commission on Palestine. And this commission recommended a partition of Palestine. You know, there was a minority plan and a majority plan. The minority members were talking about a federal Palestine, where the Palestinian Arab population and the Jewish population, both of them having their separate political entities, but joined together in a federal system. That was a minority plan, but the majority was supporting the partition into the Palestinian Arab state and the Jewish state. And India was a member, and it was supporting the federal plan, not partition, because we already by then had the experience of partition, which was very devastating, as you all know. Even though the partition plan was adopted, what happened in 1948, when Britain was about to withdraw, was the declaration of the State of Israel. So a new state, explaining a new state, was formed in 1948. It was a unilateral declaration of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The UN resolution for an Arab state and a Jewish state, no Arab state was coming into being. No Palestinian state was coming into being. But the Jewish state was established by the Jewish entities, which were substantial in number by that time in Palestine. So, if it was Zionist ideology on the one hand, that idea of Jewish national home and the World Zionist Organization, etc., and Jewish immigration to Palestine, and the inhabitants of Palestine, trying to grapple with the situation, and then the emergence of the conflict, etc. What happened is that from 1948 onwards, it became what is usually termed as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the new entity of Israel was coming into being in 1948. And that changed the whole the demography of the region, the politics of the Palestinian entity, and so on. A very landmark development in that sense. There were many atrocities, etc. I'm not going into the details of that. In 1948, after the formation of the State of Israel, there was an Arab-Israeli war in 1948. But by the end of that war, what happened was that Israel was now controlling not only what is designated to a Jewish land in the partition plan of the UN, but it was also controlling much more territories which were assigned to the establishment of an Arab state for the Palestinians. One major thing as far as the Palestine question is concerned, the Palestinians who were part of historical Palestine, a large chunk of it has become the state of Israel in 48. Many of the Palestinians living there had to flee, had to go from their homes, from their villages. Many villages were destroyed. A large chunk of villages were destroyed. Many stories, have come about at that point itself, but now you have greater historical clarity about the extent of atrocities against Palestinians, removing them from their villages, etc., during that period of time. And a large chunk of Palestinian refugees from that part of Palestine which became Israel, they were going to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. West Bank and Gaza Strip are, the Gaza Strip were controlled by Egypt, and the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. But what you have is most of these Palestinian refugees ending up in different countries, a large chunk of them in West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip. So this will be the only people who are refugees in their own land. The West Bank and Gaza Strip, which were not forming part of Israel when it was formed. So many Palestinians from the Palestinian lands which became Israel were becoming refugees in the West Bank and Gaza, and large number of refugees in Jordan, and large number of refugees in South Lebanon, and many other parts of the world, almost every part of the world, Latin America, North America, and Europe, and so on and so forth. So there starts the one major problem: Palestinian refugees. The Palestinian quest for a homeland, what was promised in the UN partition plan, was never coming into being. And this is precisely what I pointed out in the beginning itself, that quest for an independent Palestinian state, a sovereign independent Palestinian state, was never coming into being. And even now, it's still a dream. It has not been achieved. This is the major problem. What happened in 1967 is further devastation as far as the Palestinians are concerned. That the West Bank and the Gaza Strip all were captured, apart from the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, the Golan Heights of Syria, all were captured by Israel in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the Six-Day War. By that time, Israel became a very strong state, full support from the United States, military assistance, and many other things. So from 48 to 67, it was building up its military strength. There were lots of assistance from the Western world to build the Israeli state. And that was again for the peril of the Palestinians, because they found that their lands are now being occupied by the state of Israel. Not only that, the Palestinians did not get the promised state for themselves in the partition resolutions, but in 67, whatever was left with in the historical Palestine after Israel being formed, the rest of Palestinian territories also came under the control of Israel in the 67 war. So in 67, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem was under the control of Israel from 1948 itself. But East Jerusalem was under the control of the Palestinians, through the Jordanian regime. And the West Bank, Gaza Strip, all these Palestinian territories came under Israeli occupation. An illegal occupation, because once the war is over, they were supposed to withdraw from that. The UN Security Council Resolution 242, immediately after the 1967 war, called for the immediate withdrawal of Israeli forces from the occupied territories, East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza. But that never happened. Even now, these territories are under Israeli occupation, even though Israeli military was withdrawn from the Gaza Strip. But that withdrawal did not mean much as far as the Gazans are concerned, because every now and then you could see Israeli bombardment of Gaza, as if Gaza is almost an extension of a territory which Israel can always do whatever it wants to do, but there is resistance from the Palestinians. That's important. So now, from 67 onwards, the Palestinian people are now divided. A major chunk of Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and 1/5 of the Israeli population are also Palestinians, around 21%. So Israel has a Palestinian minority, Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians. So within the state of Israel, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, those who are traditional residents of East Jerusalem and West Bank and Gaza, plus the refugees, Palestinian refugees who came when Israel was formed in 48. So they are also there in the West Bank and Gaza. And then the big Palestinian diaspora in Jordan, in Lebanon, in North Africa, in various parts of the world. So the Palestinians are now scattered like that. The occupation of Israel from 1967 continues even now. And a sovereign Palestinian state is still not being established. What happened in between was in 1987, there was big uprising in Palestine, the Intifada, as the Palestinians call it, the uprising. And that was conducted mainly by the women and children of the occupied Palestinian territories, that's West Bank and Gaza, and which was fairly a non-violent struggle, except children throwing stones to Israeli tanks, the occupying force, etc. That was a very significant development as far as Palestinian resistance is concerned. But most of the resistance from 1967 onwards was conducted under the aegis of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, whose leader was Yasser Arafat, as you know. So from the 60s, the PLO was becoming the most important organization, even though it's not a single organization, it is an umbrella organization. There were several other constituent organizations within the PLO. And, initially there were Arafat was the leader. You had many other, the communist parties, various other parties, the PFLP and the DFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, etc. Also allying with the Al-Fatah organization. The Fatah organization is Arafat's organization, which was the main constituent element of the PLO. So under Arafat, what was happening from the 60s onwards was, particularly after 1967, was that the Palestinians were giving more importance to armed struggle against Israel. And by mid-70s, there was a shift in PLO's own thinking. So there is that famous speech by Yasser Arafat in the UN General Assembly. He was addressing the UN General Assembly by stating that I've come here with a freedom fighter's gun and an olive branch. Don't allow the olive branch to fall from my hands. This was his request to the world community, because we are fighters, but we are ready for peace. And that quest for peace, to keep that quest for peace intact, it's the responsibility of the world, of international actors, to see that peace is established as far as Palestinians are concerned. But nothing much was achieved. And then, the Palestinian leadership suffered a whole lot in 1970 in Jordan, because the Jordanian king unleashed a big suppression of the Palestinian movement in Jordan. And then there was again further inflow of Palestinian refugees from Jordan to South Lebanon. So much of the Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership was functioning from Lebanon. But then after 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the Palestinian leadership had to shift their activity from Lebanon also. They went to North Africa. In the meanwhile, in 1987, you had the Intifada, which I was mentioning, which is a very important uprising in the West Bank and Gaza. As a result of the raising of the consciousness about the Palestinian question in the world, that Intifada was well noted by the international community. Before that, also the PLO got a nation-state status in a lot of countries, particularly members of the non-aligned movement, because Arafat was, present in the non-aligned, movements own forum. India, for example, gave the PLO a nation-state status. So even though Palestine did not have a homeland, we gave it a nation-state status and then established a Palestinian embassy in New Delhi and so on. Few countries across the world did that, and then many countries recognized the PLO. UN also recognized the PLO as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This was under Arafat. So after the first Intifada in 1987, in 1993, you have the Oslo Conference happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the Oslo Conference gave the Oslo Accord, gave the Palestinians some rights to come back from the diaspora, established what is called the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And a Palestinian Authority was established. Arafat came back to Palestine and headed that Palestinian Authority until his death. But what happened was that many Palestinians in the Palestinian leadership opposed the Oslo process because they thought that this is a kind of succumbing to Israeli pressure because nothing much is going to be achieved through the Oslo process. So you have some kind of municipal powers for the Palestinian Authority. No sovereignty, no state, but some authority to look after the security, not fully the security, because major part of the security thing is done by the occupying Israeli forces. You have the municipal kind of rights for controlling cities like Ramallah, etc. And that's still continuing. But over a period of time, this Palestinian Authority, now for quite some time now, after the death of Yasser Arafat, is headed by Mahmoud Abbas. And the PLO itself was basically losing that coherence. Many constituent elements went along their own particular ways, so that Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority is there. But the Palestinian Authority most of the time had to do their work, particularly in the security affairs, etc., in such a manner that there is a coordination between the Israeli state, the occupying force, and the Palestinian Authority. And most Palestinians find it extremely difficult to choose because you are in a way facilitating occupation. And therefore, there's a big gap now growing, and which is reflected, as you have seen in this year, in the month of May, how on Sheikh Jarrah incidents near Jerusalem, the uh, the kind of eviction of Palestinians from their homes by the Israeli authorities, etc. And then the bombardment and around 260 people being killed, 260 Palestinians being killed by Israeli, uh, bombardment, particularly in the Gaza Strip, and then conflict within the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. So there is a continuing problem that Palestinians find with the Palestinian Authority, because many people across the world think that Palestinians have a state of their own. They do not have their own. It is still under occupation, you should remember. And the PLO, the Palestinian Authority itself, is in a way facilitating the continuation of occupation to an extent, which is not what it intends to do, but because there are genuine leadership who had the earlier PLO experience, etc. But in effect, the working of the Palestinian Authority is helping Israel to maintain the status quo of its occupation in the Palestinian territories. So you have seen the May 2021 happenings. One very important development now is that earlier it was very difficult for the Palestinians within the state of Israel to raise their voice in support of their Palestinian, the Palestinian community within the occupied territories and in the diaspora. But this time, after the main incidents, after the death of so many Palestinians, there was huge protests within the state of Israel also by the Palestinian minority and certain Jewish groups who were supporting the Palestinian cause within Israel. There was demonstrations and strikes in the West Bank, huge bombardment, etc., the Gaza Strip that you have seen, and resistance from there. And across the world, Palestinians in the diaspora, and also people who are in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, were demonstrating in a big manner in London, in various cities of the United States. And one of the important things that you see, the younger generation of Jewish people in United States, for example, where traditionally there's huge support from the Jewish community to the state of Israel, and the AIPAC, etc., are a big lobbying power within the United States, in support of Israel. But now there is a kind of generational shift happening, that younger people are understanding the injustice that the Israeli state is doing to the Palestinians, continuing their occupation, continuing colonial policies, building Israeli settlements, all illegal activity as far as international law is concerned. More and more Jewish settlements being built in the West Bank, almost on an everyday scale even now. And declaring, the whole of Jerusalem as part of the state of Israel, because the Palestinians were claiming East Jerusalem as the capital of their future homeland. Trump, declared Jerusalem as the capital, because most countries across the world still now don't recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They recognize Tel Aviv. Their embassies are in Tel Aviv. Indian embassy is in Tel Aviv. Many countries' embassies are in Tel Aviv, not in Jerusalem. So what you see now, and I'll conclude soon by stating, after the May incidents this year, the Palestinian issue once again came to the limelight of the international community. And Palestinians themselves, even though scattered, as I've told you from the beginning, but they were showing the Palestinian identity and projecting the Palestinian quest for a sovereign state wherever they are. And that expression of solidarity is coming up among the Palestinians themselves and from supporters of the Palestinian cause across the world. So that is one development. But the reality of politics is that Israel is a very powerful state. It still has full support from the United States. It can continue its militaristic policy. It is continuing its colonial occupation of Palestinian territories. And therefore, it is still very difficult for the Palestinians to undo that kind of colonization. They resist that colonization on an everyday scale, but they are still not powerful enough to challenge the might of the state of Israel. So that's a situation where the Palestinians are now. But that Palestinian issue is still a significant issue when we think about international politics at this point of time. Thank you very much.
Sir, we have 3 questions.
Okay.
The first is question from Manubesh Roy. Sir, why 1936 to 1939 year coming from Europe peoples to Palestine? Please tell us.
Yeah. No, the European Jews were coming to Palestine not only during 1936 to 39. They were coming from late 19th century onwards, as I've explained earlier. Particularly with the leadership of the World Zionist Organization, they were coming in waves of immigration from Europe from late 19th century onwards throughout until 1948, until the establishment of the State of Israel. So that has to be remembered. What happened in 36 is the situation became so intense that, and that was the time when more Jewish people were coming from Europe in the context of what was happening with the Nazi persecution of Jews, etc., in Europe. So there were more Jewish immigration coming into Palestine, larger in number. And therefore, the situation in Palestine was becoming very difficult in the sense that there is the conflict emerging between the original inhabitants of Palestine and the incoming Jewish people from Europe. So 36, 39, that conflictual situation was coming to the open. Earlier, it was not a kind of violent conflict between the two communities. But in 36, it became a big conflict within Palestine. So it's a continuing immigration, but there is greater volume by the 30s of Jewish immigration from Europe.
So the next question comes from Arijit Chakraborty. Do you think that Indian foreign policy faces very difficulties to Arabian Peninsula for this issue? How can India balance relations between these two nations?
I think the question is about Indian policy, the Arab in general, not only about Arabian Peninsula. When we say Arabian Peninsula, it's basically in the Gulf region. The Arab world is much wider, large chunk of West Asia and lots of Arab countries in North Africa and so on. So I think the question is about the Arab world. India's policy towards Palestine traditionally has been, a support to the Palestinian cause. That was coming from India's own independence struggle. The leaders of independence, whether it was Mahatma Gandhi or Nehru, Maulana Azad, they all have stated in clear-cut terms their support to the Palestinian cause. Because, again, as I've told you, Britain was the mandatory power in Palestine. We were also struggling against British colonialism. And therefore, there is an anti-colonial alliance that is coming throughout the Arab world, because many other parts in Egypt and many others, you had anti-colonial struggles happening. And therefore, in the Arab world in general and in Palestine in particular, during our independence movement, there was support to the Palestinian cause, and therefore, Mahatma Gandhi's statements about Palestine is very famous. Palestine belongs to the Arabs, in the same sense as France belonged to the French, or Britain to the British, and things like that. So a strong support to the Palestinians, stating that Palestine is not a Jewish homeland, as the Zionists at that point were claiming, and declaring clear-cut support. This is true with Nehru. It's true with many other national leaders of that period. So independent India under Nehru took that as an important foreign policy measure, even though India recognized the state of Israel. A few years after that, early 1950s, India recognized the state of Israel, but did not have full diplomatic relations with Israel. That full diplomatic relations with Israel was established only in 1992, even though recognition was forthcoming in the initial times of the establishment of the State of Israel was concerned. Until 1992, we had only an Israeli consulate in Bombay. But in recent times, there's a kind of marked shift from 1990s itself, after the establishment of full diplomatic relations. There's strong relationship between the state of India and the state of Israel in security terms, in military terms. You people know about Pegasus and many other things. In agricultural field and many other things. There's an exponential growth in Indo-Israel relationship. The Indian government was stating that it will not affect our relationship with Palestine, etc. And then there is what is called a de-hyphenation. Palestine is treated separately and Israel is treated separately. So it's not together with that hyphen, but that is removed. That's what foreign policy makers tell us. But the reality on the ground is that Israel is an occupying force in Palestine. It's a colonial force in Palestine. And therefore it's very difficult to say that these two things are not linked, the lives of the Palestinians and what the Israeli state is doing. But Indian government plays with that. Now more and more Arab countries are recognizing the state of Israel. It started with Egypt signing an Egypt-Israeli peace treaty in 1979. They already had the Camp David Accord in 1978, but 1979 an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And therefore Israel is being recognized by Egypt. Then Jordan recognized it, and they also have relationship with Israel. And recently, what is called the Abrahamic Accords, etc. Coming up, and more countries recognizing. So India's own position with respect to Israel, etc., is not a major problem as far as India's relations with Arab countries are concerned. It's still a problem about our own commitment to the Palestinian cause is concerned. Shall we go to the next one? Yeah.
Sir, one more question from Arijit Chakrabarti, Tripura University. Do you think that the extremist activities of the Palestinian Liberation Army is putting the bad impact to collect the support of the international communities on the favor of Palestine?
The Palestinians do not have an army of their own. It's a kind of, security forces. The Palestinian Authority has a security force, okay? Because the Israeli army is controlling Palestinian territories. Because Palestine is not a sovereign nation to have a national army, etc. So there is no Palestinian national army. There are Palestinian fighters. In the Gaza Strip, for example, Hamas still believe in fighting the state of Israel. But as I've told you, the PLO opted for peace treaties, the Oslo process, the Oslo Accords, therefore, and things like that. That's how the Palestinian Authority was established. So there are all kinds of resistance in Palestine. But they do not have an army of their own, because Palestine is still not a sovereign nation.
Sir, no more question. Thank you so much, sir, for this informative session. You made this topic too easy for us, and also thank you for this clean presentation. Thank you for giving us time for your busy schedule. In future, we hope you will be with us. Good night, sir, and good night for all of you. Thank you,
Thank you
sir.
very much. Thank you very much.